Howdy, it's Kyle, counting down the 20 most affordable big cities in the US. With so many people wanting to live in big cities but they can't afford it, I thought it would be nice to take a look at which ones are actually kind of affordable. And if you want to skip to the countdown, I'll leave a timestamp, but I want to go over the methodology first. For the data, I'm looking at the county level, not the city or metro. And the reason why I went with the county level is because at the city level, that's where you have both the really expensive houses, the most historic ones, the big mansions, the $1 million condos, and the high rises, but also the lowest value houses in the metro area as well. But I didn't want to include the entire metro area because that includes many outer suburbs, exurbs, and even some rural areas. So I thought by looking at the county level, that'd be a good compromise between the city and the entire metro area. For the video, I'll be looking at income to housing value ratio for the metropolitan areas in the country with more than 2 million people. For income, I'll be looking at two different indices. One is the Bureau of Economic Analysis per capita personal income, and the other is the Census Bureau's Household Income Index. I'll be looking at the average of those two since they're both a little bit flawed. For housing values, I'm looking at two different indices as well. One is the Realtor.com housing value, and the other is the Zillow index. And I'll take the average of those two as well, so the ratio of those two, and I'll be ranking them out as a top 20. Now, do keep in mind that there are only 37 metro areas with over 2 million people, so just because you're in the top 20 doesn't mean you're super cheap. The first few on this list are actually going to be above average expense compared to other big cities in the country, but yeah, let's take a look at the 20 least expensive cities in the US. Starting off at number 20 is Raleigh, North Carolina. The area has relatively high wages in high-tech and biomedical industries, and the region is growing very quickly. But as often the case is with relatively high-wage areas, the houses are expensive too, and median house value is approaching $500,000. Next door neighbor state capital, Nashville, Tennessee is next. Wages aren't quite as high as Raleigh, but the houses aren't quite as expensive. So the overall wage to housing cost ratio is just slightly higher in Nashville than Raleigh, but they are just about the same. Up next in the same region is Charlotte, North Carolina. The wages aren't quite as high as in Raleigh, but the housing costs aren't quite as high either. And as often the case in some of these fast-growing Sun Belt cities, a lot of folks want to move there, putting more demand on the limited housing there. So Charlotte's expensive, but not quite as bad as its cross-state neighbor, Raleigh. Keeping it in the Sun Belt, up next is Atlanta. Atlanta has the highest wages of any city in the Southeast, but its housing values are also pretty high as well. But nonetheless, because the wages are well above average for the region, Atlanta is the cheapest city in the country with a median house value over $400,000. San Antonio, Texas. Of the four major metro areas in Texas, San Antonio is usually the one talked about the least. But it is still growing quite a bit. The wages aren't as high as the other Texas cities, but the houses aren't as expensive either. But with that being said, it is the most expensive city with a median house value in the $200,000 range. Our first stop up north in this video is Columbus, Ohio. A little below average wages, but well below average housing values. Columbus is the fastest growing of the major metros in Ohio, and like many other fast growing areas, high-tech jobs are driving it. Going back to Texas, but this time Dallas. The household income is a little bit lower than you might be expecting, but the median house value is lower than you might be expecting also. Dallas is growing a lot and is mainly a suburban type growth, but there is some nice infill in the city of Dallas and the houses aren't too expensive. Next up, Minneapolis. The region has the second highest household income of all the cities on this list, but also a relatively high median house value as well. But even with the high housing costs, the high wages make up for and make Minneapolis cheaper than most of the Sunbelt cities. But it's not cheaper than all of the Sunbelt cities, as Houston, Texas is less expensive. And much like Dallas, the income levels might be a little bit lower than you were expecting, but the housing costs are a lot lower than you might be expecting. Of the four major metros in Texas, Houston is the one that is growing the slowest, so it does make sense that the houses would be a little bit cheaper there, but still under $300 is pretty good. Up next is Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The city has the second lowest income of all the cities on this list, but the housing values are also quite low. I don't think Milwaukee is anywhere near as bad as the rap it gets in the press, and it is a relatively inexpensive city in which to live. Starting off the top 10 is Baltimore, Maryland. Baltimore does get a lot of bad press, and it is a pretty rough big city, but it also is fairly cheap. Incomes are pretty good, and the median house value is under $300,000. At number 9 is Chicago. The overall household income is pretty average, a little above average, and the median house value is only $300,000. That's really low for a big city. Oftentimes, when you talk about Chicago being cheap, they might say, well, yeah, it's so dangerous and violent. But first of all, most of the city is not like that. And plus, again, this is talking about the entire Cook County, so not just the city of Chicago, and houses there are pretty inexpensive. Next in line is Philadelphia. Relatively low household income, especially for the northeastern part of the U.S. But the median house value is only $228,000. And just like Chicago, most of Philadelphia is at least pretty good. So people often think of the worst, but there are plenty of nice places in Philadelphia and relatively inexpensive homes. Next on the list is Kansas City, Missouri. The same household income as Philadelphia, but the median house value is $1,000 less. Generally speaking, Kansas City isn't one of the most well-loved cities in the U.S., and it isn't growing really fast, but it also isn't that bad. And then you look at the low median house value, it's like, wow, that's even better. At number 6 is Indianapolis. This is another city that often gets a lot of hate, but I don't think it's all deserved. It certainly isn't one of the most high-wage cities in the country, but the very low housing cost means that Indianapolis is overall fairly affordable. Number 5, Cincinnati, Ohio. Similar stats to Indianapolis, but a little bit higher income and a little bit higher housing costs. And Cincinnati is one of my favorite cities in the country. I love the compact nature, the walkability of it, the hilliness. And the city and the metro area really aren't growing that much. So with these low housing costs, that make Cincinnati a relatively affordable place, and a pretty cool one as well. Number 4, St. Louis. And this counts the city of St. Louis along with St. Louis County. So the incomes are pretty good and the housing values are relatively low. And just like Chicago, people often only think about the negatives with St. Louis, some of the high crime and poverty. So St. Louis, another one of my favorite cities and also ranking high on this list. All right, you knew it was going to be near the top. Here it is, Detroit. And yes, it does have the lowest income of all the cities on this list and also has the lowest housing cost of cities on this list. And I do want to reiterate this again, that this isn't just the city of Detroit, it's the entirety of Wayne County, so this includes the inner ring suburbs. And even houses in nice neighborhoods on quiet streets with relatively low crime are not that expensive. Okay, the second cheapest city in the country is Pittsburgh. You have decent wages, but very low housing costs. I've never quite understood why houses in Pittsburgh are so cheap, and I was just there fairly recently and walked all around, checked out some of the housing values, some of the nice neighborhoods, and even some of the quiet, nice neighborhoods, you can get a house for well under $200,000. And the big city in the U.S. where you get the most bang for your buck is Cleveland. And just like Chicago and Milwaukee and St. Louis, people often just focus on the negative things, but I really do like Cleveland. I was there recently and was quite surprised at how nice it was. I think of all the major cities in the U.S., Cleveland is the one that gives the impression that is the most different of what you were expecting. And not only is Cleveland not the hellhole that people think it is, it also has the single highest wage to housing ratio in the country. Okay, so that's a list of the 20 big U.S. cities with the highest wage to housing value ratios. A couple of big takeaways. One is the geographic correlation. 7 of the cities ranked 20 to 11 are in the Sun Belt, and every single one of the top 11 are in the Rust Belt. So what we have right now is more and more people moving to the Sun Belt, which makes it more and more expensive. And some of these people are leaving the colder climates in the Rust Belt, which makes some of the housing there cheaper. Eventually, things will probably swing back to the north, so this might be a great time to invest in some of these old Rust Belt cities while the houses are still cheap. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give me a thumbs up to let me know you approve, and subscribe to this channel if you're interested in learning more about geography from a nerdy perspective. But yeah, thanks for watching. Geography King, signing out. I'd like to give a special thanks to my superior patrons for their support. If you're interested in buying a pin for the viewer pin map or just to support the channel, check out my Patreon page, link in the description. And as always, thank you very much.